What if the most important event in the entire story of humanity is one that almost no one remembers? Not a war, not a plague, not the fall of an empire etched into monuments and museum walls, but something older, something buried so deep in time that even the earth itself barely holds its memory. A catastrophe so vast, so silent in its aftermath, that the species it nearly destroyed went on living as though nothing had happened at all. And yet, something did happen. Something that left its fingerprint not in stone or scripture, but in the blood running through your veins right now as you lie there listening to this, wherever you are in the world tonight. So before you let your body sink fully into the comfort of wherever you're resting right now, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love reading those. It reminds me that this strange, quiet corner of history connects people across every time zone on this planet. The very same planet that, 74,000 years ago, nearly lost us all. Now, let that thought settle for a moment. 74,000 years. It is a number that slips past the mind almost too easily, like water through loose fingers. It is too large for the imagination to hold with any precision, too remote to feel personal, and perhaps that is part of the problem. Because when something happens so far back that no written language existed to record it, no civilization stood to witness it, no oral tradition stretches reliably across its gulf, it is easy to treat it as irrelevant, a curiosity for geologists, a footnote in a textbook chapter most students skip. But what if the reason it feels so distant is precisely because it was so devastating? What if the silence around it is not accidental, but structural? A silence built into the very fabric of how few of us were left to remember. There is a peculiar fact about human beings that most people never encounter unless they wander deep into the corridors of population genetics. It is this: for a species that now numbers over 8 billion, Homo sapiens possesses remarkably little genetic diversity. Far less, in fact, than one might expect from a species that has spread across every continent, adapted to every climate, and built civilizations of extraordinary complexity. Chimpanzees, a single species confined largely to the forests of Central and West Africa, carry significantly more genetic variation within their populations than the entirety of the human race. Gorillas, too. Even certain species of fruit flies exhibit broader genetic diversity across their colonies than humans do across the full span of our global population. This is not a trivial observation. It is, in genetic terms, a scar, a signature left behind when a population crashes to such a small number that the surviving gene pool narrows drastically, a phenomenon biologists call a genetic bottleneck, the neck of a bottle through which only a thin stream of life can pass. And when scientists trace the timeline of that bottleneck in human DNA, when they follow the branching paths of mitochondrial lineages and Y chromosome markers backward through the millennia, many of these paths converge on a single approximate window, a window that opens roughly 70 to 80,000 years ago, a window that coincides with troubling precision with the largest volcanic eruption the Earth has experienced in the last 2.5 million years, the eruption of Toba. If you were to visit the island of Sumatra today, in the western arc of the Indonesian archipelago, you would find there a lake. It is not an ordinary lake. It stretches nearly 100 kilometers from end to end, cradled in the green mountains of the Batak highlands, its surface placid, its shores quiet. Tourists come for the scenery. Farmers tend fields along its banks. Churches and mosques rise in the small towns that ring its edges, their bells and calls drifting across water that, on certain mornings, lies so still it mirrors the sky as if the world has doubled itself. Lake Toba is beautiful, but its beauty is a mask. Because Lake Toba is not a lake formed by rivers or rain, it is a caldera, a collapsed wound in the surface of the earth, left behind when the ground itself fell inward after something beneath it emptied catastrophically. The water that fills it now sits in the hollow where a mountain once stood, a mountain that, in a span of hours or days, ceased to exist. What replaced it was absence. A void roughly 30 kilometers wide and 100 long, punched into the crust of the planet by an eruption that ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. 2,800 cubic kilometers. Let that number breathe for a moment. The eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, which Americans still recall as one of the most dramatic natural disasters of the 20th century, ejected roughly 1 cubic kilometer of material. Krakatoa in 1883, whose detonation was heard 3,000 miles away and whose tsunamis killed tens of thousands, roughly 25 cubic kilometers. Tambora in 1815, whose ash cloud caused the so-called year without a summer across the northern hemisphere, blanketing crops in frost in July and triggering famine from New England to China, roughly 160 cubic kilometers. Toba released more than 17 times what Tambora did, more than 100 times Krakatoa, more than 2,800 times Mount St. Helens. It was by every measure volcanologists use a supereruption, an event rated at the maximum level on the volcanic explosivity index, a category 8, a class of eruption so rare that the Earth experiences one only once every 100,000 years or so. And the last time it happened at that scale, it happened beneath the ground where that quiet, beautiful lake now rests. And something happened to us. Something that thinned the thread of human existence to a whisper. Something that left its mark not in ruins or relics, but in the uniformity of our chromosomes, in the shallow roots of our family tree, in the strange and haunting closeness that connects every living person on Earth to a handful of survivors who endured what may have been the longest, coldest, darkest period our species has ever known. But here is where the first question opens, the one that will follow us through every part of this journey tonight. Because if the eruption was as catastrophic as the evidence suggests, and if humanity was driven to the edge of extinction, then how exactly did anyone survive at all? What did they do? Where did they go? And why does the story of their survival remain so poorly understood, so lightly told, so strangely absent from the grand narratives we construct about who we are and where we came from? The ash has long since settled. The caldera has long since filled with water, but the questions remain suspended, like dust in still air, waiting for someone to breathe them in. And that lake in Sumatra, so calm on its surface, still holds something beneath it. Something the water has not yet finished telling. The water holds its shape so perfectly that, from certain elevations above the shoreline, Lake Toba appears less like a body of water and more like a wound that has learned to be still. The Batak people who have lived along its edges for centuries carry stories about the lake, stories of origin, of spirits, of a world beneath a surface that mirrors the one above. Samosir Island rises from the centre of the caldera, like a thought the earth refused to let go, its volcanic spine pushing upward through the water, as if the land itself were trying to remember what it used to be. But the geology beneath all of this tells a story far older than any human tradition, and far less gentle. To understand what Toba was before it became a lake, one must first understand what a supervolcano is, and perhaps more importantly what it is not. It is not simply a large volcano, it is not a taller version of Vesuvius or Fuji or Etna, the kind of cone-shaped mountain that appears in children's drawings with a neat plume of smoke rising from its peak. A supervolcano often has no visible peak at all. It does not announce itself with a dramatic silhouette against the horizon. Instead, it hides, it spreads, it exists as a vast magma chamber buried kilometers beneath the surface, swelling slowly over tens or hundreds of thousands of years, pressurizing itself in silence until the crust above it can no longer hold. And when it finally gives way, the result is not an eruption in the conventional sense. It is a collapse. The ground does not explode upward so much as it falls inward, and in that falling, It unleashes forces that defy the scale of anything most human beings have ever been asked to imagine. The Toba caldera, the scar that now holds the lake, measures roughly 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. This is not a crater. A crater is what remains after a single explosive vent blows outward. A caldera is what remains after the roof of an underground chamber drops into the emptied space below, like a house whose foundation has been quietly removed. The volume of magma that Toba expelled during its eruption 74,000 years ago has been estimated by multiple geological studies. Among them the work of Craig Chesner and Bill Rose in the 1990s, and later refinements by researchers at the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program. At approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of dense rock equivalent. Some estimates push this figure even higher. The eruption produced what geologists call the youngest Toba tuff, a layer of volcanic rock, pumice and compressed ash that blanketed much of Sumatra and beyond, in some places reaching depths of several hundred meters. But the ash did not stay on Sumatra. It could not. An eruption of this magnitude injects material not merely into the atmosphere, but into the stratosphere, the upper layer of the Earth's atmospheric envelope, where particles can remain suspended for months or years, carried by high-altitude winds across the entire globe. And the evidence of this dispersal is not theoretical. It is physical. It has been found. In the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers began identifying a distinct layer of volcanic ash, chemically matched to Toba, in deep-sea sediment cores pulled from the floor of the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Arabian Sea. The layer appeared at a consistent depth across thousands of kilometers of ocean floor, a ghostly blanket lying undisturbed beneath millennia of subsequent sediment. On land, the picture was even more striking. In central India, at sites across the Deccan Plateau and the Sun River Valley, Toba ash deposits were found measuring 2 to 3 meters thick. Not centimeters, but meters. A layer so dense and so widespread that it must have buried entire landscapes in a matter of days. In the Jwalapuram Valley of southern India, excavations led by archaeologist Michael Petraglia uncovered Toba tephra, lying like a geological curtain between two distinct layers of human habitation, a visible dividing line between the world before and the world after. And then, remarkably, the ash was found in Africa. This was not expected. Africa lies thousands of kilometers from Sumatra, across the full breadth of the Indian Ocean. And yet, beginning in the early 2010s, researchers, most notably the late geologist Gene Smith of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, developed techniques to identify cryptotephra, microscopic shards of volcanic glass so small they're invisible to the naked eye, each one no wider than a fraction of a human hair. Using these methods, Smith and his colleagues detected Toba origin glass shards in sediment layers at archaeological sites in eastern and southern Africa, at Lake Malawi, at sites in Tanzania and South Africa, even in marine sediment off the coast of East Africa. The particles had travelled more than 7,000 kilometres from their source. They had crossed an ocean, and they had settled invisibly into the soil where early humans walked and hunted and slept. The implications of this geographic spread are worth pausing over. If microscopic glass from a single eruption can be found on 2 different continents and across multiple ocean basins, then the atmospheric loading, the sheer volume of particulate matter injected into the stratosphere, must have been extraordinary. And particulate matter in the stratosphere does something very specific. It reflects sunlight. It scatters incoming solar radiation back into space before it can reach the surface. It dims the sky. It cools the earth. And if the volume is large enough and the particles remain aloft long enough, it can do something that sounds almost mythological but is grounded in well-documented atmospheric science. It can turn day into twilight, for weeks, for months, perhaps in the case of Toba for years. Climate modelers have attempted to reconstruct the atmospheric aftermath using data from ice cores, ocean sediment, and the known chemistry of Toba's ejecta. The sulfur dioxide output alone, distinct from the ash, has been estimated at as much as 6 billion metric tons, a figure that dwarfs even the most sulfur-rich eruptions in the historical record. When sulfur dioxide reaches the stratosphere, it converts into sulfate aerosols, tiny reflective droplets that form a haze capable of blocking a measurable percentage of incoming solar energy. Alan Robock and his colleagues at Rutgers, using general circulation models, estimated that Toba could have produced a global temperature drop of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, not a mild chill, but a plunge into conditions approaching those of a full glacial advance, compressed into a span of years rather than millennia. Other researchers have modelled the effect more conservatively. Claudia Timrek and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology, using coupled atmosphere-ocean simulations, suggested the cooling may have been closer to 3 to 5 degrees. Still significant, still devastating for ecosystems dependent on stable growing seasons, but perhaps not the apocalyptic freeze that earlier models implied. The debate continues. The data is incomplete. The models are sensitive to assumptions about particle size, injection height, and ocean feedback mechanisms that remain only partially understood. But one thing is not debated. Something happened to the sky. The geological record confirms it. The ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve it. Thin layers of sulfate deposition that match the Toba timeline, etched into ancient ice like a scar in frozen time. The light that reached the surface of the earth dimmed. The warmth that sustained plant life receded. And somewhere beneath that darkened sky, scattered across Africa and possibly parts of southern Asia, small bands of Homo sapiens looked up and saw a world that no longer looked the way it had the season before. What they did next, whether they understood what was happening, whether they had words for it, whether they huddled closer together or scattered further apart, none of this was recorded. But the question that follows the ash across every continent where it has been found is always the same. Not what fell from the sky, but what happened on the ground in the weeks and months and years after the light stopped coming through, and whether the darkness that settled over the earth 74,000 years ago ever truly lifted, or whether some part of it still lingers, encoded in the narrowness of our genes, in the fragility we have inherited but rarely name. There is no human record of the moment itself, no eyes that watched it and left words behind. No cave wall carries its image. No oral tradition, however ancient, however layered with myth, can be reliably traced to the hour when the earth beneath northern Sumatra buckled and gave way. And yet, the physical evidence left behind is so extensive, so violently legible in the rock and sediment and ice, that geologists have been able to reconstruct the sequence with a degree of detail that feels almost indecent, as if the planet itself kept a diary that humans were never meant to read. It would have begun beneath the surface, kilometers beneath it, the magma chamber that had been building pressure for tens of thousands of years. Some estimates suggest the system had been accumulating silicic magma for as long as 400,000 years, reached a critical threshold. The exact trigger remains uncertain. It may have been a tectonic shift along the Sumatran fault system. It may have been the slow accumulation of volatile gases, water vapour, carbon dioxide, sulphur, dissolved in the magma under immense pressure, reaching a point where the chemistry itself became unstable. Whatever the cause, the result was not gradual. It was instantaneous in geological terms. The roof of the chamber fractured, and the pressurized contents of the Earth's interior, superheated temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, began to move. The eruption column, the vertical jet of gas, ash, and fragmented rock that punches upward through the vent, would have risen with extraordinary speed. In Plinian eruptions, which are named after Pliny, the young's description of Vesuvius in 79 AD, and represent some of the most powerful eruptions on record, the column can reach heights of 25 to 35 kilometers. But Toba was not Plinian, it was ultra-Plinian. Modelling by researchers such as Stephen Self at the Open University and others has suggested that Toba's eruption column may have exceeded 40 kilometers in height, punching through the troposphere entirely and injecting material deep into the stratosphere. At that altitude, the ash and aerosol particles entered global circulation patterns, jet streams and stratospheric currents that would carry them around the planet within weeks. But the column was only part of the story. In eruptions of this scale, the column does not remain stable. It cannot. The sheer volume of material being ejected overwhelms the buoyancy of the rising gas, and portions of the column collapse under their own weight, cascading back down the flanks of the eruption site in what volcanologists call pyroclastic density currents, superheated avalanches of gas, rock fragments, and ash that travel across the ground at speeds that can exceed 300 kilometers per hour, incinerating and burying everything in their path. These flows are not survivable. They are not outrunnable. They carry temperatures of several hundred degrees and move with a momentum that flattens forests and fills valleys. The youngest Toba tuff, the welded ignimbrite deposits left behind by these flows, covers an area of more than 20,000 square kilometers on Sumatra alone, reaching thicknesses of 600 meters in some proximal zones. 600 meters! That is taller than most skyscrapers. That is a burial so deep that the landscape beneath it ceased to exist not merely as habitat, but as topography. The sound would have been extraordinary. Eruptions far smaller than Toba have produced atmospheric shock waves audible at distances of thousands of kilometers. Krakatoa's 1883 eruption was heard nearly 5,000 kilometers away on the island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean. The pressure wave from that eruption circled the globe multiple times, recorded by barographs in weather stations across Europe. Toba's detonation, if the word can even be applied to an event of this magnitude, would have generated atmospheric disturbances on a scale difficult to model precisely, but almost certainly detectable across the entirety of the planet's atmospheric envelope. In the forests and coastlands of mainland Asia, in the grasslands of eastern Africa, creatures with no understanding of volcanism would have felt the air change. A rumble too low for conscious hearing, a pressure shift in the inner ear, something wrong, arriving from a direction that could not be named. And then the ash began to fall. Not immediately, not everywhere at once. The coarser particles, pumice fragments, lithic clasts, chunks of solidified magma would have fallen first, raining down on Sumatra and the surrounding seas within hours. But the finer material, the microscopic glass shards and sulfate aerosols lofted into the stratosphere, would have taken longer. Days, weeks, spreading westward across the Indian Ocean on upper atmosphere winds, thinning as they travelled but never disappearing entirely. In India, the accumulation would have been staggering. The 2 to 3 metre thick ash deposits found at sites like Jwalapuram and across the Sun River Valley represent not a single dramatic fall, but a sustained, relentless accumulation, layer upon layer, settling over landscapes like a slow, grey suffocation. Rivers would have choked. Water sources would have turned alkaline, contaminated by the chemical leaching of volcanic glass. Vegetation would have been buried, and with it, the food sources of every herbivore, every omnivore, every creature dependent on the photosynthetic chain that begins with sunlight reaching green leaves. And it is here that the eruption transitions from spectacle to something else entirely. Because the fire and the ash and the sound, all of these are dramatic. All of these make for vivid reconstruction. But they are not what made Toba dangerous to species living thousands of kilometers from the blast. What made Toba dangerous was what came after the spectacle ended. What made it dangerous was the quiet. The sulfate aerosol haze that spread across the stratosphere did not dissipate quickly. Unlike tropospheric particles, which are washed out by rain within days or weeks, stratospheric aerosols can persist for years, maintained at altitude by the stability of the stratosphere itself. And for as long as they persisted, they filtered the sun. Not completely, not into total darkness, but enough. Enough to shift the balance of energy reaching the Earth's surface, enough to cool the oceans by fractions of a degree that cascaded into larger shifts, enough to shorten growing seasons, to push tree lines downward, to convert grassland into scrub and scrub into barren ground. Enough, perhaps, to make the difference between a world that could sustain large populations of mobile, warm-climate primates and a world that could not. The fire lasted days, the ash fell for weeks, but the cold may have lasted a decade, perhaps longer. And it is in that cold, in that prolonged dimming of the world's light, that the true story of Toba begins. Not the story of the eruption, which belongs to geology, but the story of what happened to the small, scattered, genetically fragile populations of Homo sapiens, who woke one morning to a sky that looked wrong, and who had no way of knowing whether the sun would ever fully return. What they faced was not fire. It was patience, the long grinding patience of a world growing colder, season by season, with no explanation and no end in sight. And patience, it turns out, is a far more effective killer than any eruption. Cold does not arrive the way fire does. Fire announces itself, with light, with sound, with the unmistakable urgency of something that demands immediate response. Cold is different. Cold seeps. It enters through edges and margins, through the thinning of a season that should have ended but didn't, through the morning frost that lingers an hour longer than it did the year before. Cold is patient in the way that only geological forces can be patient, and its patience is what makes it lethal. Not in a single dramatic moment, but across the accumulation of countless small failures. A fruit that doesn't ripen, a herd that doesn't return, a child born into a season that has forgotten how to be warm. 74,000 years ago, in the months and years following the eruption of Toba, the Earth entered what atmospheric scientists refer to as a volcanic winter, a period of sustained global cooling driven not by orbital shifts or changes in solar output, but by the reflective haze of sulfate aerosols suspended in the stratosphere. The concept is well established in climate science. Every major eruption in the historical record has produced a measurable, if temporary, cooling effect. Tambura's 1815 eruption led to what Europeans and Americans called the year without a summer. 1816, a year of crop failures, food riots, and strange atmospheric phenomena, including vivid, blood-red sunsets that inspired paintings by J.M.W. Turner and a literary gathering in Geneva where Mary Shelley, trapped indoors by incessant cold rain in June, began writing Frankenstein. Pinatubo's 1991 eruption in the Philippines, a relatively modest event by supervolcanic standards, lowered global average temperatures by approximately 0.5 degrees Celsius for nearly 2 years. These are eruptions whose atmospheric loading was a fraction of what Toba delivered. The models diverge on the severity of Toba's cooling. Alan Robock's simulations, published in the early 2000s, suggested a temperature drop of as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in some regions, sustained for several years, a scenario sometimes referred to as a volcanic winter approaching the conditions of a nuclear winter, a parallel that Robock himself, who'd spent much of his career modelling the climatic effects of nuclear conflict, was well positioned to draw. Under this scenario, the consequences for life on the Earth's surface would have been extreme. Forests would have died back, grasslands would have contracted, freshwater systems would have been disrupted by altered precipitation patterns. The photosynthetic base of nearly every terrestrial food web would have been severely compromised, and with it the entire chain of organisms, from insects to ungulates to the primates who depended on them, would have been thrown into crisis. But more recent modelling has complicated this picture. Claudia Timrek's work at the Max Planck Institute, published in 2010 and refined in subsequent studies, used higher resolution ocean atmosphere coupled models to suggest that the cooling effect may have been more moderate, perhaps 3 to 5 degrees Celsius globally, with regional variations. The difference matters enormously. 5-degree drop is harsh, it reshapes ecosystems, shifts climate zones, stresses populations, but it is not the same as a 15-degree plunge into quasi-glacial conditions. Timrek's models also suggested that the ocean's thermal inertia, the massive heat reservoir stored in the upper layers of the sea, may have buffered some of the worst effects, releasing stored warmth gradually and preventing the kind of runaway cooling that earlier models had predicted. The truth, as is so often the case in paleoclimatology, likely lies somewhere in the contested space between these estimates. And the reason it remains contested is not a failure of science, but a consequence of the timescale involved. 74,000 years of subsequent geological activity have overwritten, eroded, and obscured much of the direct evidence. Ice cores help. The sulfate spikes preserved in Greenland and Antarctic ice provide a chemical timestamp of the eruption's atmospheric impact, but they cannot tell us precisely how long the cooling lasted or how unevenly it was distributed across latitudes and hemispheres. Ocean sediment cores provide broader trends but lack the temporal resolution to distinguish a single decade of cooling from a century of gradual climate oscillation. And the archaeological record, which might in theory reveal how human populations responded, is itself sparse and fragmentary for this period. A handful of sites, a scattering of stone tools, a few layers of charcoal and bone that may or may not correlate with the Toba event. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. The eruption coincided with a period of significant climate deterioration that is visible in multiple independent proxy records. Oxygen isotope ratios in ocean sediment cores, a standard measure of past ocean temperatures, show a cooling trend that accelerates around the time of the Toba eruption and persists with fluctuations for several thousand years. Pollen records from lake sediments in tropical regions show shifts in vegetation composition consistent with cooler, drier conditions. Ice core data from Greenland shows a sulfate anomaly at approximately 74,000 years before present, followed by a period of depressed temperatures that aligns broadly with the onset of marine isotope stage 4, a cold phase within the broader glacial cycle that dominated the Pleistocene. Whether Toba caused this cold phase, accelerated it, or merely coincided with it, is one of the most quietly contentious questions in quaternary climate science. The distinction matters, because if Toba was the primary driver, then the eruption's impact on human populations was direct and catastrophic. But if the eruption merely added its weight to a cooling trend already underway, then the human story becomes more complex. It becomes a story not of a single blow, but of compounding pressures, volcanic dimming layered on top of orbital cooling, layered on top of ecological stress, layered on top of whatever internal dynamics were already shaping the size and distribution of Homo sapiens populations in Africa and beyond. And this layering is important because it changes the nature of the question we're asking. It moves us from, did the eruption nearly kill everyone, to something more unsettling. Were we already vulnerable before it happened? Because a species at full strength, large in number, widely distributed, genetically diverse, occupying a range of ecological niches, can absorb a catastrophic shock. It bends, it recovers. But a species that is already small, already fragmented, already clinging to marginal environments in a world growing colder by the century, that species does not need a super volcano to push it toward extinction. It only needs one more thing, one more pressure. One more season without enough food, without enough warmth, without enough children surviving to replace the ones who didn't. The volcanic winter, whether it lasted 6 years or 60, was that one more thing. And the evidence that it mattered, that it left a mark not just on the climate, but on the species living through it, comes not from thermometers or satellite data, which did not exist, but from something far more intimate, something carried inside the cells of every person alive today, something that speaks not in degrees of temperature, but in the language of adenine and thymine, guanine and cytosine, the 4 letters of the genetic alphabet, arranged in patterns that tell the story of who survived and how many of them there were. The question that surfaces from beneath the long winter is not how cold it was, it is how few of us remained when the cold finally broke. And the answer to that question is written in a code that the survivors themselves never knew they were carrying. Every person alive today carries a record of catastrophe inside their body. It is not written in memory. It is not preserved in language or tradition, or the fading photographs of ancestors whose names have been forgotten. It is written in nucleotides, in the molecular architecture of DNA that coils within every cell, replicating itself with each division, passing forward not just the instructions for building a human being, but the scars of every crisis the lineage has endured. And the most striking of these scars is not a mutation. It is an absence, a narrowness, a strange and haunting uniformity that should not exist in a species as numerous and as widespread as ours. In 1998, a paleoanthropologist and environmental scientist named Stanley Ambrose, working at the University of Illinois, published a paper that drew together 2 threads of evidence that had, until then, been pursued largely in isolation. The first was the growing body of data on the Toba eruption, its magnitude, its atmospheric consequences, its potential to induce prolonged volcanic winter. The second was a puzzle that had been quietly troubling population geneticists for more than a decade: the unexpectedly low genetic diversity observed across the entire human species. The puzzle was real, and it was not subtle. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, the small loop of genetic material inherited exclusively through the maternal line, passed from mother to child without the recombination that shuffles nuclear DNA each generation, had revealed that the total variation among all living humans was remarkably shallow. The most genetically distant human populations on Earth, a sand bushman in the Kalahari and a Norwegian fisherman, a Papuan Highlander and an Amazonian forager, differ from one another at the mitochondrial level by an amount that is dwarfed by the variation found within a single subspecies of chimpanzee. This is not a matter of perception or cultural bias, it is a measurable, quantifiable fact. The mitochondrial coalescence point, the moment in time when all living humans' maternal lineages converge on a single common ancestor, the so-called mitochondrial eve, dates to roughly 150 to 200,000 years ago, but the effective population size implied by the branching pattern of those lineages is startlingly small. Not millions, not hundreds of thousands, thousands, perhaps at certain points only thousands. Something had squeezed the human population through a passage so narrow that the genetic diversity on the other side was permanently diminished. The metaphor biologists use, the bottleneck, is apt in its physicality. Imagine a wide river forced through a gap in the rock barely wider than a man's shoulders. On the other side, the water flows again, spreads again, fills new channels and pools. But it carries only what made it through the gap, the sediment left on the upstream side, the fish that could not navigate the narrows, the branches and debris that accumulated against the stone. All of this is lost. The river on the far side is still a river, but it is not the same river. It is thinner. It remembers the constriction in its chemistry, in its biology, in the reduced variety of everything it carries forward. Ambrose proposed that Toba was the rock, that the eruption and its aftermath, the volcanic winter, the ecological collapse, the sustained pressure on food sources and habitat, had reduced the global population of Homo sapiens to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. Some subsequent estimates have been even more conservative. A 2005 study by Chad Huff and colleagues using Y chromosome data, suggested an effective male population size of as few as 2,000 during the bottleneck period. Other analyses, drawing on autosomal DNA and more sophisticated coalescent models, have produced somewhat larger numbers, perhaps 20 to 30,000. But even these represent a catastrophic reduction from what the pre-Toba population is thought to have been. The numbers themselves carry a weight that is difficult to absorb: 3,000 individuals, 10,000. In a world without agriculture, without permanent settlement, without any of the infrastructure that modern humans rely upon to buffer environmental shocks. 3,000 people scattered across eastern and southern Africa, perhaps clustered in a few refugial zones where food and water remained accessible, each group numbering in the dozens or low hundreds, separated from other groups by distances measured not in miles but in weeks of walking. The entire future of the species, every civilization, every language, every war, every song, every child born in every century since, resting on the survival of a population small enough to fit inside a modern sports stadium, and not a large one. It is a thought that resists belief, and perhaps that is why it remains so poorly integrated into the popular understanding of human history. The story most people carry in their minds, the story of human ascent, of progress from cave to city, from stone tool to silicon chip, has no room for a moment when the entire enterprise nearly ended. The narrative of progress is fundamentally allergic to the idea of near extinction, because near extinction implies fragility, and fragility implies that the arc of human history is not inevitable but contingent, dependent not on destiny or divine favour or the inherent superiority of the species, but on luck, on geography, on the accident of which small group happened to be in the right place, with the right skills at the right moment. Ambrose's hypothesis, sometimes called the Toba Catastrophe Theory, was not universally accepted. It was, and remains, a hypothesis, not a settled conclusion. But its power lay not only in its explanatory reach, but in the discomfort it provoked. Because if it is even partially correct, then the genetic architecture of every living human being is not merely a product of adaptation and selection. It is a monument to survival, a memorial to the thousands who did not make it through the gap, a living record of a moment when the difference between existence and oblivion was measured not in armies or technologies, but in the resilience of a few hundred scattered families who found a way to eat, to stay warm, to keep their children alive through a winter that lasted years. And there is another implication, Masoon, one that is rarely spoken aloud but hovers at the edges of every discussion about the bottleneck. If all living humans descend from that small surviving population, then the genetic differences between modern human groups, the variations in skin colour, hair texture, facial structure, all the superficial markers that human societies have used for millennia to divide themselves into categories of race and ethnicity, arose after the bottleneck. They are recent. They're shallow. They sit atop a foundation of shared ancestry so narrow and so deep that, in genetic terms, the concept of race dissolves into what it always was, a story told by the surface about a depth it cannot see. The bottleneck did not just shape our bodies, it shaped the illusion of our differences, and the volcano that caused it, if it caused it, did not merely test whether humanity could survive. It determined, in a sense, what kind of humanity would emerge on the other side. But the question that Ambrose raised in 1998 did not close with his paper, it opened. Because in the years and decades that followed, researchers went looking for the survivors, not in DNA databases or statistical models, but in the ground itself, in the ash layers of Africa, in the sediment of caves where firelight once flickered against stone walls, in the middens of shellfish and the scatter of broken tools left behind by people whose names, whose faces, whose languages are irretrievably lost, but whose choices, small, daily desperate choices about where to walk, what to eat, when to move, wrote the next chapter of the human story in a script no one would learn to read for 70,000 years. And what they found, buried beneath the ash, was not what anyone had expected. The cave sits above the sea, not far above, perhaps 15 meters depending on the tide and the century, but high enough that the people who once used it could watch the water without being taken by it. Pinnacle Point it is called now, a rocky promontory jutting from the southern coast of South Africa, near the town of Mossel Bay, where the Indian Ocean meets the continent's edge in a long, restless collision of current and stone. The landscape around it is fynbos, dense, scrubby coastal vegetation, wind-beaten and salt-resistant, clinging to thin soils above ancient sandstone. It is not a place that announces itself as significant. There are no monuments here, no plaques visible from the road, nothing to suggest that this unremarkable stretch of coastline may have been one of the places where the human species, pressed to the edge of its existence, refused to disappear. The excavations at Pinnacle Point began in the early 2000s, led by Curtis Marion, a paleoanthropologist at Arizona State University whose career had increasingly focused on a question that few researchers were willing to frame so bluntly. Where exactly did humans go when the world became uninhabitable? Not uninhabitable in the metaphorical sense, not merely difficult or challenging, but genuinely physically hostile to the survival of a warm climate primate with no fur, no claws, no venom, and a metabolic demand that required consistent caloric intake in a world where calories were becoming scarce. Marion's argument, developed over more than a decade of fieldwork and publication, was that the southern coast of Africa, and the Cape region in particular, functioned as a refugium during periods of extreme environmental stress. A refugium is not merely a safe place, it is a last place. A place where the conditions that sustain life persist, even when they have collapsed elsewhere. And the Cape Coast, Marion argued, possessed a combination of features that made it uniquely suited to this role. The ocean was the key. While inland environments were subject to the full force of volcanic cooling and the contraction of vegetation zones, the coast offered something that no amount of climate deterioration could entirely eliminate: marine resources. Shellfish, in particular, mussels, limpets, whelks, the slow and abundant creatures that cling to intertidal rocks and require no hunting technology more sophisticated than a hand and a sharp stone, represented a caloric safety net that was largely independent of terrestrial ecosystem health. The sea does not care whether the sky is full of ash. The tides still come. The nutrients still upwell, the shellfish still grow, and at Pinnacle Point in layers dating to the period between roughly 70 and 90,000 years ago, Marion and his team found exactly what this hypothesis predicted. Dense accumulations of shellfish remains interspersed with stone tools, ochre fragments, and the charcoal residue of fires that had been tended and maintained within the cave over long periods of occupation. The ochre is worth pausing over. Red ochre, iron oxide, ground and mixed, sometimes heated to deepen its colour, appears at Pinnacle Point in quantities and contexts that suggest more than utilitarian use. It appears in association with deliberate processing, grinding stones stained with pigment, ochre pieces bearing facets from repeated scraping. Ochre has no caloric value. It does not make tools sharper or fires hotter. Its uses, as far as archaeologists can determine, are primarily symbolic: body decoration, marking of objects, perhaps ritual purposes that are impossible to reconstruct from the material remains alone. And its presence at a site dating to the very period when the Toba bottleneck may have been thinning the human population to its most precarious margin raises a question that is at once pragmatic and philosophical. Why, at the edge of extinction, would people invest time and energy in something that serves no immediate survival function? Why, when every calorie counted, would they grind pigment and paint themselves or their tools or their dead? One answer, and it is only one among several, that symbolic behaviour is itself a survival function, that the capacity to create meaning, to embed shared symbols in objects and bodies, to construct and maintain social identities through ritual and representation, is not a luxury added after survival has been secured. It is part of how survival is secured. It binds groups together. It maintains social cohesion under stress. It turns a collection of individuals into a community with shared reference points, shared obligations, shared reasons to cooperate rather than fragment. And if this is true, if symbolism and sociality are not decorations on the surface of survival, but structural elements of it, then the ochre at Pinnacle Point is not a mystery. It is evidence. Evidence that the people living in that cave were not merely enduring the crisis, they were organising their response to it. They were maintaining the social fabric that made collective survival possible. But the evidence at Pinnacle Point carries another layer of significance, one that connects directly to the atmospheric detective work of Gene Smith and his colleagues. Because in the sediment layers at nearby South African sites, and at sites across eastern Africa from the Rift Valley to the shores of Lake Malawi, Smith's cryptotephra analysis revealed the presence of microscopic Toba glass shards. The ash had reached Africa, it had settled into the soils and sediments where people lived, and yet in several of these locations the archaeological record shows no dramatic discontinuity, no sudden abandonment, no disappearance of human habitation followed by a long gap before reoccupation. In some cases, the material culture above the Toba ash layer is essentially continuous with what lies below it. The same types of tools, the same patterns of site use, the same evidence of sustained occupation. This continuity is puzzling. If Toba's volcanic winter was as severe as the strongest versions of the catastrophe theory suggest, if global temperatures dropped by 10 to 15 degrees and stayed there for years, then one would expect to see dramatic disruption in the human record. Abandonment of sites, shifts in technology, evidence of population collapse visible in the density and distribution of artifacts. And at some sites, there is indeed evidence of change. Shifts in faunal assemblages suggesting altered hunting patterns, changes in raw material sourcing that might indicate altered mobility ranges. But the wholesale collapse, the blank layer of emptiness that a true near-extinction event might be expected to leave behind, is not consistently present. It appears in some places and not others. It is visible in some proxy records and absent from others. This inconsistency has fueled a growing counter-narrative within the scientific community. A narrative that does not deny Toba's eruption or its atmospheric consequences, but questions whether those consequences were truly severe enough and globally uniform enough to have driven the human species to the brink. The survivors at Pinnacle Point with their shellfish and their ochre, their fires and their enduring presence in the archaeological record, seem to suggest that at least some human populations were not merely surviving the aftermath of Toba. They were in a sense ignoring it, continuing to live as they had before, sustained by coastal resources that the volcanic winter could diminish but not destroy, held together by social bonds that the cold could strain but not sever. And this raises a possibility that is in some ways more unsettling than the catastrophe narrative itself. Because if some populations weathered Toba with relative stability while others were devastated, then the bottleneck was not a uniform, species-wide compression. It was selective. It hit some regions harder than others, some ecologies more than others, some groups more than others. And the question of who survived and who did not was determined not by chance alone, but by where they were, what they ate, and, perhaps most importantly, how they were organised. The cave at Pinnacle Point does not answer every question. It does not tell us how many people lived there, or how long they stayed, or what happened to the groups that were not fortunate enough to live beside the sea. But it tells us something that the genetic data alone cannot. It tells us that survival was not passive. It was not simply a matter of waiting for the ash to settle and the cold to lift. It was active. It was strategic. It was, in ways that the archaeological record can only gesture toward, deeply human. And somewhere to the north, in the dry lowlands of the Horn of Africa, another group of survivors was doing something that would not be discovered for nearly 74,000 years. Something that, when it was finally unearthed, would add yet another dimension to the question of what it meant to endure the worst thing the Earth had ever done to us. The site was not grand. It was not a cave with soaring ceilings, or a cliff face overlooking a dramatic valley. It was a scatter of sediment along a seasonal riverbank in the lowlands of northwestern Ethiopia, near the border with Sudan, a place called Shinfa-Metema, named for the small town nearby, in a region where the land flattens into dry, thorn-scrubbed plains that shimmer with heat for most of the year, is not the kind of place that draws tourists or filmmakers. It's the kind of place that draws archaeologists only when the geology whispers that something important might be buried beneath the unremarkable surface. The excavations were led by John Kappelman, a professor of anthropology and geological sciences at the University of Texas at Austin, along with a team that included specialists in geochronology, lithic technology, and the identification of that most elusive of geological traces, cryptotephra. The work had been ongoing for years, but the results published in 2024 in the journal Nature landed with a force that reverberated through the paleoanthropological community, not because they described a catastrophe, but because they described the opposite. They described adaptation. They described people who, standing in the ash shadow of the largest eruption in human memory, changed what they were doing and kept going. The key evidence came from the stratigraphy, the layered sequence of sediments that accumulated along the ancient riverbank over thousands of years. Within that sequence, the team identified a layer containing Toba cryptotephra, the microscopic glass shards, chemically fingerprinted to match the youngest Toba tuff, that Gene Smith had pioneered techniques to detect. The shards were there. The ash had reached this corner of East Africa, more than 7,000 kilometres from the eruption source, and directly above that layer, in the sediments deposited in the years and decades following the eruption, the team found something they had not anticipated. Fish bones, hundreds of them, fragments of catfish and other freshwater species, concentrated in densities that suggested not occasional opportunistic fishing, but systematic sustained exploitation of aquatic resources. Below the Toba layer, the evidence of fish consumption was minimal. The pre-eruption inhabitants of Shinfa-Metema appeared to have been primarily terrestrial foragers, hunters of land animals, gatherers of plant foods, people whose subsistence strategies were oriented toward the savanna and woodland environments that surrounded them. But after the ash fell, something shifted. The fish bones appeared. The tool assemblage changed. New forms emerged, including small, carefully shaped projectile points that some researchers have interpreted as components of composite weapons, possibly arrows or throwing spears designed for hunting in altered environments. The implication was striking, and Kappelman framed it with deliberate care. The people at Shinfa-Metema had not simply endured the aftermath of Toba. They had responded to it. They had recognized, consciously or through the accumulated pressure of failing food sources, that the world around them had changed, and they had changed with it. They had turned to the river. They had exploited a resource that, like the shellfish at Pinnacle Point, was partially insulated from the terrestrial ecological collapse that the volcanic winter may have triggered. The river still flowed, the fish still swam, and the people who figured out how to catch them survived. There is a temptation, when encountering evidence like this, to romanticize it, to frame it as a triumphant narrative of human ingenuity overcoming impossible odds. And there is truth in that framing, but it is incomplete, because the record at Shinfa-Metema does not tell us how many people were there. It does not tell us how many groups in the surrounding region attempted the same adaptation and failed. It does not tell us about the families who did not live near a river, who did not have the knowledge or the tools to fish, who wandered into a landscape stripped of familiar resources and simply stopped. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic moment, but gradually, quietly, one failed foraging trip at a time, one hungry season bleeding into the next, until the group was too small to sustain itself and the last of them joined the silence that Toba had spread across the world. Survival in the archaeological record is always a biased sample. We see the ones who made it. We study their tools, their food remains, their campsites. We reconstruct their strategies and marvel at their flexibility. But the ones who did not make it left little or nothing behind. A few scattered tools in a landscape that was subsequently reworked by erosion and time. A genetic lineage that terminated without descendants. A story that no one will ever tell because no one survived to begin it. The record at Shinfa-Metema is a record of success, but it is framed by an absence that is far larger than any single site can illuminate. The absence of all the groups whose adaptation was not flexible enough, whose location was not fortunate enough, whose social networks were not resilient enough to carry them through. Kapperman himself noted this tension in interviews following the paper's publication. The survival at Shinfa-Metema, he suggested, was not merely a matter of intelligence or technological innovation, it was a matter of behavioral flexibility. The capacity to abandon a strategy that was no longer working and adopt a new one, rapidly under pressure, without the benefit of precedent or instruction. This is not a trivial capacity. It is not something that all hominin species possessed in equal measure. And it may be, though this remains deeply speculative, one of the factors that separated Homo sapiens from the other hominin species that shared the planet 74,000 years ago, and that, in the millennia that followed one by one, disappeared. The fish bones at Shinfa-Metema are small. They are fragile. Many of them are fragmentary, broken by time and compression into pieces that require careful laboratory analysis to identify. They are not the kind of evidence that makes headlines or fills museum display cases, but they may represent something more important than any golden mask or monumental inscription. A moment when a small group of people, faced with the slow collapse of everything they knew, looked at the water flowing past them and saw not just a river, but a future. Whether that future was guaranteed, whether it was ever anything more than a thin and trembling possibility sustained by luck and geography, and the stubborn refusal of a few hundred individuals to lie down and die, this is something the bones cannot tell us. But they can tell us that the refusal happened, that someone, somewhere, in the ash-dimmed lowlands of the Horn of Africa, chose to adapt rather than accept. And that choice, repeated across dozens or hundreds of scattered groups, in coastal caves and river valleys and highland refugia whose locations we may never identify, is the reason any of us exist to ask the question. But adaptation at Shinfa-Metema was not the only story unfolding in the shadow of Toba's ash. Thousands of kilometers to the east, on the Indian subcontinent, the evidence told a different story. One that did not fit neatly into either the catastrophe narrative or the resilience narrative, and that raised questions neither framework could fully answer. The ash in India was not microscopic. It was not cryptotephra requiring specialized laboratory techniques to detect. It was visible. It was thick. In some locations across the Deccan Plateau and the river valleys of central and southern India, the youngest Toba tuff lay in deposits measuring 2 to 3 meters deep, a grey-white stratum of volcanic glass, and pumice fragments so distinct in the geological column that it could be identified by eye, a line drawn across the landscape separating everything that came before from everything that came after. And it was here, in this most heavily impacted zone outside of Sumatra itself, that the archaeological evidence became most confusing. The excavations at Jwalapuram in the Juraru Valley of Andhra Pradesh were led by Michael Petraglia of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, along with a team of Indian and international collaborators. The site had been identified precisely because of its Toba deposits. The ash layer was unmistakable, and it offered a rare opportunity to examine human occupation directly above and below a known volcanic event of global significance. What Petraglia and his team found, when they carefully excavated through the ash and into the layers on either side, was unexpected. Stone tools appeared both below and above the Toba tephra, and not just any tools. Middle Paleolithic assemblages, flaked stone artifacts showing techniques of preparation and reduction that were consistent with deliberate, skilled manufacture. The tools above the ash were in broad typological terms similar to those below it. The technology had not dramatically changed. The people, whoever they were, had continued. This finding, published in Science in 2007, generated immediate controversy, and the controversy has not been resolved. The central question was not whether the tools existed. They clearly did, but who had made them? The assumption embedded in much of the Toba Catastrophe Theory was that the volcanic winter would have devastated human populations in South Asia most severely, given the region's proximity to the eruption and the extreme thickness of the ash deposits. If the tools above the ash were made by Homo sapiens, then the catastrophe narrative required significant revision, because it would mean that modern humans had survived in one of the most heavily impacted zones on the planet, contradicting the model of near-total population collapse. But there was another possibility. Homo sapiens was not the only toolmaker active in southern Asia 74,000 years ago. Other hominin species, potentially Homo erectus or archaic populations whose taxonomic status remains debated, may have been present in the region. If the post-Toba tools at Jwalapuram were made by a different species, then their survival would not necessarily challenge the bottleneck hypothesis as it applies to modern humans. The tools would simply represent a different lineage, one that weathered the ash but eventually went extinct for other reasons. Petraglia argued for continuity, for the presence of modern humans both before and after the eruption, surviving in the Jwalapuram Valley despite the catastrophic ashfall. His interpretation was supported by the technological similarities between the pre- and post-Toba assemblages and by the broader argument that Homo sapiens had dispersed out of Africa earlier than the traditional model suggested, reaching southern Asia well before the Toba eruption. This early dispersal hypothesis, which has gained traction in recent years thanks to fossil discoveries at sites like Mislia Cave in Israel, dating modern human presence outside Africa to at least 180,000 years ago, and genetic evidence of archaic admixture events that imply earlier contact between sapiens and other hominins. This hypothesis makes room for human populations in India at the time of Toba. But critics, including some who broadly supported the catastrophe theory, pushed back. Chris Clarkson and others pointed out that typological similarity in stone tools does not necessarily indicate continuity of population. Different species can independently produce similar tool forms, and without human fossils, actual bones or teeth, from the Jwalapuram sequence, the question of who made the tools could not be definitively answered. The site had preserved stone and ash beautifully, but the acidic soils of the Indian tropics are hostile to bone preservation. The makers of the tools had left their work behind, but had taken their bodies with them into the deep anonymity of decomposition. The debate around Jwalapuram illuminates something important about the study of deep human history, something that extends well beyond the specific question of Toba's impact. It reveals how much of our reconstruction of the past depends not on what we find, but on what we assume about what we find. The same set of stone tools, lying in the same stratigraphic position, can support radically different narratives depending on whether one assumes they were made by Homo sapiens or by another species. The evidence does not change, the interpretation does, and the interpretation is shaped by theoretical commitments, disciplinary traditions, and the weight of existing models that, once established, exert a gravitational pull on how new data is received. In the case of Toba, this gravitational pull operates in both directions. Those committed to the catastrophe narrative tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as consistent with severe population collapse. Those skeptical of the catastrophe narrative tend to interpret the same evidence as consistent with continuity and resilience. And the actual inhabitants of the Uheru Valley, the people or hominins who napped stone tools in the shadow of meters-deep ash, remain silent, offering their artifacts without commentary, leaving the meaning to be fought over by descendants who arrived on the scene 74 millennia too late to ask them directly. What can be said is this: someone was there, before the ash and after it. Someone struck stone against stone in a valley buried under volcanic debris, producing flakes with edges sharp enough to cut meat or scrape hide. Whether that someone was us, whether they carried the same mitochondrial lineages that flow through every living human, is a question that the ground at Jwalapuram has so far refused to answer. And perhaps the refusal itself is a kind of answer, a reminder that the past does not owe us clarity, that the deeper one digs, the more the certainties dissolve, replaced not by ignorance but by a more honest form of knowledge, the knowledge that some questions remain genuinely open, genuinely unresolved, suspended between competing possibilities that the evidence can support but not decide. The ash in India holds tools, it holds mystery, and it holds a question that leads inevitably beyond the boundaries of our own species, outward, toward the other beings who walk the earth when Toba erupted, beings who faced the same darkened sky, the same failing warmth, the same slow starvation of the world's green surfaces, beings who were in many ways our equals, and who, unlike us, did not make it through to the other side. 74,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was not alone. This is a fact that the popular imagination has been slow to absorb, despite decades of fossil discoveries and genetic revelations that have made it inescapable. The Earth of the late Pleistocene was not a stage set for a single protagonist. It was an ensemble. Multiple species of the genus Homo coexisted across the Old World, some in overlapping territories, some in isolated pockets separated by geography and climate. All of them tool makers, all of them social, all of them shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure into beings whose intelligence and adaptability, while varied, were by no means trivial. The Neanderthals were the most familiar of these contemporaries, stocky, powerful, cold-adapted humans who had occupied Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived. Their brains were as large as ours, in some cases larger. They buried their dead, at least occasionally, in arrangements that suggest intentional, possibly ritual behaviour. They made sophisticated stone tools, the Mousterian industries, with their carefully prepared cores and standardised flake production, and there is growing evidence that they used pigments, created simple ornaments, and may have possessed some form of symbolic communication. They were not the brutish cavemen of 19th century caricature. They were intelligent, resourceful, and deeply adapted to the harsh environments of glacial Europe. And yet, within roughly 30,000 years of Toba, a span of time that is brief by evolutionary standards, the Neanderthals were gone. The last evidence of their presence dates to approximately 40,000 years ago, in the caves of southern Iberia and possibly Gibraltar, where small populations appear to have lingered after the species had vanished from the rest of its former range. The cause of their extinction remains one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology. Climate change, competition with expanding Homo sapiens populations, disease, demographic fragility, some combination of all of these, the explanations multiply and none has achieved consensus. But the timing is provocative. The Neanderthal decline accelerated during and after the period of the Toba eruption. And a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in early 2026 added a new and startling dimension to this timeline. A team led by Cosimo Post at the University of Tübingen analysed mitochondrial DNA from 59 Neanderthal individuals spanning the period between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, the late Neanderthals, the final chapter of the species, what they found was a genetic signature of catastrophic population collapse. Around 65,000 years ago, roughly 9,000 years after Toba, the mitochondrial diversity of European Neanderthals narrowed dramatically. The branching tree of maternal lineages, which had been relatively diverse before that point, was pruned to a single surviving lineage. Every late Neanderthal in Europe, the data suggested, descended from a single refugial population, a small group that had weathered some crisis, probably in southwestern France, and then expanded outward to recolonize the continent. The parallels with the human bottleneck are striking, and they raise a question that is as uncomfortable as it is unavoidable. Did Toba affect the Neanderthals as well? The eruption's atmospheric consequences were global. The volcanic winter did not respect species boundaries. If the cooling was severe enough to reduce Homo sapiens populations in Africa to a few thousand individuals, then Neanderthal populations in Europe, already adapted to cold but dependent on large-bodied prey and extensive territories, would have been subjected to similar pressures. The timing of their genetic bottleneck, while not perfectly synchronous with Toba, falls within the broad window of post-eruption climate deterioration that defines marine isotope stage 4. The Denisovans, that ghostly hominin lineage, known almost entirely from DNA extracted from a few fragments of bone and teeth found in a Siberian cave, were also present 74,000 years ago. Their range, inferred from genetic traces found in the DNA of modern Melanesian and Southeast Asian populations, may have extended from Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. What Toba did to them, whether it thinned their numbers or reshaped their distribution, is almost entirely unknown. The fossil record of the Denisovans is so sparse that their existence was unsuspected until 2010, when a genome was sequenced from a finger bone found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains. They're a species defined almost entirely by absence, an absence of fossils, an absence of archaeological context, an absence of everything except the genetic echoes they left behind in the DNA of living people who carry fragments of their genome without knowing it. And then there was Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, a diminutive hominin species discovered on the island of Flores in Indonesia in 2003, whose remains date to as recently as 50,000 years ago. Flores lies roughly 2,000 kilometers southeast of the Toba caldera. The ashfall there would have been significant. What happened to the hobbits in the aftermath of the eruption is a mystery wrapped inside the larger mystery of their existence. A species so unexpected, so morphologically strange, that its discovery forced a fundamental reassessment of how many branches the human family tree contained in the late Pleistocene. The point is not that Toba caused the extinction of all these species. The evidence does not support so clean a narrative. The point is that the eruption occurred in a world of hominin diversity, a world where multiple species of intelligent, tool-using, socially organized beings shared the planet, and that, in the tens of thousands of years following the eruption, that diversity collapsed. One by one, the other species disappeared. Homo sapiens remained, and the question of why us? Why not them? What quality or circumstance or accident separated the survivors from the vanished? Is a question that Toba sharpens but does not answer. Perhaps it was not strength. Neanderthals were stronger. Perhaps it was not brain size. Neanderthals matched us there. Perhaps it was not cold adaptation. Neanderthals surpassed us. Perhaps it was something else, something less visible in the fossil record, something that leaves no trace in bone or stone, but that, under the specific pressures of a world growing colder and darker, made the difference between persistence and disappearance. Something that operated not in the body but in the space between bodies, in the connections, in the networks, in the invisible architecture of social life that holds a species together when everything else is falling apart. Not everyone agrees that Toba nearly destroyed humanity. This is worth stating plainly, because the catastrophe narrative, for all its dramatic appeal, has never achieved the status of scientific consensus. It remains a hypothesis, compelling, well-argued, supported by multiple lines of circumstantial evidence, but also challenged by data that does not fit, by models that produce different results, and by researchers whose reading of the same geological and genetic record leads them to fundamentally different conclusions. The most direct challenge came not from a single study, but from an accumulating body of evidence suggesting that Toba's climatic impact, while real, may have been significantly less severe than the early models predicted. In 2018, a study published in Nature by Chad Yost of the University of Arizona and colleagues examined sediment cores from Lake Malawi in East Africa, one of the deepest and oldest lakes on the continent, whose floor sediments preserve a continuous record of regional climate stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Yost's team found the Toba cryptotephra layer in the core, confirming that the ash had indeed reached southeastern Africa, but when they analysed the environmental proxies surrounding that layer, pollen, charcoal, diatoms, organic carbon, they found no evidence of a dramatic ecological collapse. The vegetation did not disappear. The fire regime did not change dramatically. The lake's biological productivity continued without the kind of catastrophic interruption that a severe, multi-year volcanic winter would have been expected to produce. This was not an isolated finding. Other lake sediment records from tropical Africa told similar stories. Stories of continuity, of ecosystems that absorbed the impact of Toba without collapsing, of climatic effects that were measurable but not catastrophic. And when Yost and his colleagues compared the Toba interval with other known climate events preserved in the same cores, they found that the eruption footprint was not dramatically larger than those of smaller volcanic events or the background variability of Pleistocene climate cycles. The volcanic winter, if it occurred, appeared to have been regional rather than global, affecting some areas severely while leaving others largely untouched. This interpretation was reinforced by the modelling work of Claudia Timrek, whose high-resolution climate simulations had already suggested a more moderate cooling scenario than the Robock models. Timrek's argument, refined over multiple publications, centred on the physics of aerosol particle size. Larger sulfate aerosol particles, she noted, are less efficient at scattering sunlight and also fall out of the stratosphere more quickly. If Toba's sulfur injection produced particles on the larger end of the spectrum, a possibility supported by some analyses of sulfate deposition rates in ice cores, then the eruption's radiative forcing would have been weaker and shorter-lived than the early catastrophe models assumed. The sky would still have dimmed, the temperatures would still have dropped, but the duration and severity of the cooling would have been substantially reduced. The genetic bottleneck itself, the narrowness of human diversity that Ambrose had linked to Toba, also came under renewed scrutiny. Population geneticists began to question whether a single, sharp bottleneck was the best explanation for the observed patterns, or whether a series of smaller, more gradual reductions, driven by the general harshness of Pleistocene environments, by local droughts and famines and epidemics that left no geological trace, could produce the same genetic signature. A 2010 study by Atkinson and colleagues, using mitochondrial DNA diversity as a proxy for population size, suggested that human populations had been declining for tens of thousands of years before Toba, part of a long, slow contraction that may have begun well before the eruption and continued well after it. Under this model, Toba was not the cause of the bottleneck. It was merely one event among many, layered on top of a pre-existing vulnerability that had deeper, more complex roots. And then there was the question of timing. The genetic bottleneck, as inferred from coalescent analysis of mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages, is not precisely dated. It falls within a broad window, roughly 50 to 100,000 years ago, that includes Toba, but also includes numerous other potential drivers of population decline: ice ages, mega droughts, the inherent demographic fragility of small, mobile populations living in hostile environments. Attributing the bottleneck specifically to Toba requires not just temporal coincidence, but a causal mechanism, a chain of evidence connecting the eruption to the population decline that is robust enough to exclude alternative explanations. And that chain, for all the ingenuity of its construction, has weak links. None of this means the catastrophe theory is wrong. It means it is unproven, which is a different thing entirely. The evidence is consistent with a scenario in which Toba devastated human populations, but it is also consistent with scenarios in which the devastation was more limited, more regional, more entangled with other pressures that the volcanic winter exacerbated but did not create. The truth may lie not in choosing between catastrophe and continuity, but in recognizing that both occurred simultaneously, that the eruption's impact was severe in some regions and negligible in others, that some populations collapsed while others adapted, and that the overall effect on the species was real but unevenly distributed, a patchwork of crisis and resilience that does not reduce to a single narrative. But if Toba was not the sole author of the bottleneck, if the near extinction of humanity was not caused by a single volcanic event, but by a constellation of pressures converging on a species already stretched thin, then the story becomes in some ways more disturbing rather than less. Because it means there was no single villain, no dramatic catastrophe to point to and say that was the moment. Instead, there was a slow grinding down, a long attrition. A species losing ground century by century, squeezed by forces too diffuse to name and too slow to recognize, until the population reached a threshold below which recovery became uncertain and extinction became possible. And it raises the question that neither the catastrophists nor their critics have fully answered. If it was not Toba alone that brought us to the edge, then what was it about Homo sapiens? What hidden quality, what unrecorded advantage that pulled us back? The advantage may have been invisible, not inscribed in the size of the brain or the strength of the arm or the sharpness of the tool's edge, but in something far more difficult to fossilize: the quality of the connection between one mind and another, the density of the web, the reach of the network, the capacity to maintain relationships, not just with the people standing beside you at the fire, but with people you had not seen in months, people living beyond the next ridge or across the river, people whose existence you held in memory and whose cooperation you could call upon when the local environment failed and survival depended on access to resources, information or refuge that your own group did not possess. This is not a poetic abstraction. It is a hypothesis with growing empirical support, and it may be the closest thing we have to an answer to the question of differential survival among hominin species. In April 2026, a study published in a major journal revisited the question of why Neanderthals went extinct while Homo sapiens survived, and its conclusion, drawn from computational modeling of population dynamics under environmental stress, centered on a single variable: social connectivity. The models showed that even small differences in the size and flexibility of social networks, the number of groups a given population maintained contact with, the frequency of intergroup exchange, the willingness to move between groups in response to resource scarcity, could produce dramatically different outcomes under identical environmental pressures. Species with more connected populations survived, species with more isolated populations did not. The archaeological evidence, fragmentary as it is, supports this picture in suggestive ways. Homo sapiens sites from the Middle Stone Age in Africa, the period surrounding the Toba event, show evidence of long-distance raw material transport. Stone tools made from obsidian or other distinctive materials are found at sites located dozens or even hundreds of kilometers from their geological source. This does not necessarily mean that individuals traveled those distances themselves. It may mean that materials moved along chains of exchange, passed from group to group, hand to hand, across networks of relationship and reciprocity that spanned far larger territories than any single band could occupy. Neanderthal sites, by contrast, tend to show more localized raw material sourcing. Their tools were made from stone found within shorter distances of the sites where they were used. This does not mean Neanderthals lack social networks. It means those networks may have been smaller, tighter, more geographically constrained. And then there is the symbolic evidence, the ochre and the beads. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, in layers dating to approximately 75,000 years ago, tantalizingly close to the Toba window, archaeologists led by Christopher Henshelwood discovered perforated shell beads and ochre plaques engraved with geometric patterns. These are among the oldest known examples of symbolic behaviour in the archaeological record. The beads, made from the shells of the marine snail Nasarius krausianus, had been deliberately pierced and appear to have been strung, perhaps as necklaces or ornaments. The ochre plaques bore crosshatch patterns that were clearly intentional, not accidental marks or utilitarian damage, but deliberate geometric designs. The significance of these objects lies not in their beauty or their complexity, but in what they imply about the minds that made them. Symbolic objects are social objects. A bead worn on the body is a signal, a marker of identity, status, group affiliation, or personal history that is legible to others who share the same symbolic system. It presupposes an audience. It presupposes shared meaning. And the creation and maintenance of shared meaning, Gazro, the capacity to agree that a shell with a hole in it means something, that a pattern scratched into ochre refers to something beyond itself, is the foundation of the kind of social life that enables large, flexible, multi-group networks to function. Without shared symbols, cooperation beyond the immediate band is difficult. With them, it becomes scalable. It becomes possible to maintain relationships across distance and time, to recognize allies and kin and trading partners by the marks they carry, to embed social information in objects that can travel further and last longer than any spoken word. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains interpretive, not proven, then the advantage that carried Homo sapiens through the Toba bottleneck was not technological, it was cultural. It was the capacity to create and sustain webs of meaning that held groups together and connected them to other groups, forming extended networks of mutual support that could buffer the impact of localized ecological collapse. When the food failed in one valley, the people there could move to another, welcomed by allies whose relationship had been maintained through exchange, through marriage, through the circulation of symbolic objects whose meaning was shared across the network. When one group's population dropped below viability, individuals could merge with other groups, preserving the genetic diversity and the accumulated knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. This is not a dramatic survival story. It does not involve heroic feats of endurance or brilliant moments of invention. It is a story about the quiet, ongoing work of social maintenance. The visiting, the sharing, the remembering, the keeping of promises across distance. It is a story about people who understood, perhaps without articulating it in words, that their survival depended not on their individual strength but on the strength of their relationships. And it is a story that the archaeological record can only dimly illuminate because the most important elements, the conversations, the agreements, the shared meals, the bonds of trust, leave no trace in stone or sediment. But the beads remain, the ochre remains, and in their survival they testify to something that mattered more than fire or flint, the human insistence on meaning, on connection, on the creation of a shared world that exists not in the landscape, but in the space between minds, a space that the ash could not bury and the cold could not extinguish. And it was from this space, this invisible architecture of social life, that the next great chapter of the human story would emerge. The chapter in which a small, battered, genetically impoverished species, having survived the worst the Earth could offer, began to move. The movement may have begun before the ash settled, or it may have begun long after. The timing remains one of the most contested questions in the study of human dispersal. But at some point in the tens of thousands of years following the Toba event, small groups of Homo sapiens began to leave Africa. Not all at once, not in a single wave or a single direction, but gradually, incrementally, following coastlines and river valleys and the shifting edges of habitable terrain. They moved outward, across the narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, along the coasts of the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent, into Southeast Asia and beyond. And from this migration, this slow, multi-generational dispersal of a species that had just barely survived its closest brush with oblivion, every non-African population on Earth today descends. The genetic evidence for this is overwhelming, and it converges from multiple independent sources. Mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and whole genome analyses all point to a single major dispersal event, or a small number of closely spaced events, originating from an African source population roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago. The non-African branches of the human family tree, for all their subsequent diversification, trace back to this narrow window. The Australian Aboriginals, the earliest known settlers of that continent, arrived approximately 65,000 years ago, carrying genetic signatures that link them to the same out-of-Africa dispersal. European populations, though they arrived later, share the same deep ancestry. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, who crossed from northeastern Asia into the New World during the last glacial maximum, carry mitochondrial lineages that ultimately root in the same African exodus. The coincidence with Toba is not lost on anyone who studies this dispersal. If the eruption occurred approximately 74,000 years ago, and the major out-of-Africa migration occurred roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, then the two events are separated by only a few thousand years, a gap that, in the context of deep time, is almost nothing. And this proximity has led some researchers to propose a connection that is speculative but intriguing, that Toba did not merely fail to destroy humanity, but may have inadvertently catalyzed its dispersal. The logic runs as follows. Before Toba, Homo sapiens populations in Africa may have been relatively stable, adapted to their local environments, sustained by established subsistence strategies, and lacking strong incentive to expand into unfamiliar territories already occupied by other hominin species. The eruption disrupted this stability. It collapsed food sources, fragmented populations, and forced survivors into refugial zones, coastal areas, river valleys, highland oases, where they developed new subsistence strategies and perhaps new social configurations. And when the volcanic winter finally eased, when the world began to warm again and ecosystems began to recover, the survivors who had been compressed into those refugia expanded outward. Not back into their old territories, which had been recolonized by altered ecologies and competing species, but forward along the path of least resistance into new environments. The southern dispersal route, the hypothesized coastal pathway from the Horn of Africa across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, along the southern Arabian coast, and eastward along the rim of the Indian Ocean, would have been an attractive corridor for coastal adapted populations. The people who had learned to exploit shellfish at Pinnacle Point or to fish the rivers at Shinfa-Metema would have possessed exactly the skills needed to sustain themselves along an unfamiliar coastline. The sea provided continuity. The intertidal zone offered food that was available regardless of the state of the terrestrial ecosystem. And the coastline itself provided a navigable pathway, a linear route that required no maps, no knowledge of interior geography, no confrontation with the unknown hazards of continental interiors. This is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. The archaeological evidence for the southern dispersal route remains thin. Sea levels have risen dramatically since the late Pleistocene, submerging the very coastlines where the earliest migrants would have camped and foraged. Whatever sites they left behind now lie beneath meters of water, inaccessible to conventional excavation. The genetic evidence supports the general direction and timing of the dispersal, but it cannot tell us whether the migrants were consciously fleeing the aftermath of a volcanic catastrophe or simply following the ancient opportunistic logic of expansion that has driven species into new territories throughout evolutionary history. But there is something in the pattern that resists dismissal. A species reduced to its smallest numbers. A world stripped of its familiar resources. Survivors clustered in coastal refugia, developing new strategies for extracting food from the sea. And then, as the climate recovers, a sudden expansion. Not just a recovery to pre-disaster population levels, but a leap outward, across oceans and continents, into territories that had never before been reached by any member of the species. It is as if the pressure that nearly destroyed Homo sapiens also unlocked something, some latent capacity for movement, for adaptation, for the colonization of unfamiliar worlds that had lain dormant as long as the familiar world remained inhabitable. The bottleneck did not just reduce the population, it may have distilled it. The survivors were not a random sample of pre-Toba humanity. They were the ones who lived in the right places with the right skills, embedded in the right social networks. They were in a sense a selected population. Selected not by intention, but by the blind, amoral filter of environmental catastrophe. And it was this selected remnant, this thin thread of humanity, carrying its narrow genes and its hard-won behavioural flexibility, that went on to populate the earth, to fill every continent, to build every civilization, to become, in time, us. The question that follows is not whether this happened. The genetic evidence confirms that it did. The question is what it means. What it means to know that every person alive today, every variation in language, culture, appearance, and belief, traces back to a population small enough to fit in a single valley. A population forged in fire and thinned by cold and carried forward by the stubbornness of people who refused to stop moving even when the world gave them every reason to. There is a story that nearly every culture on Earth tells, in one form or another. The details vary. The characters change. The geography shifts to match the landscape of whatever people are doing the telling. But the structure is remarkably consistent. A world that existed before this one was destroyed. Destroyed by water, or by fire, or by a darkness that covered the land. And from that destruction, a remnant survived. A family, a pair, a chosen few who carried the thread of existence forward into a new age. The flood myths of Mesopotamia, the Hindu concept of pralaya, the periodic dissolution of the cosmos, the Norse Fimbul winter, the great winter that precedes the destruction of the world at Ragnarok, the Aboriginal Australian stories of the Dreamtime, in which ancestral beings shaped the land and then retreated, leaving behind a world that is both permanent and fragile. The Genesis flood, the Deucalion myth of the Greeks, the Aztec legend of the five suns, each age ending in catastrophe, each followed by a new creation. The universality of these narratives has been noted by scholars of comparative mythology for well over a century. James George Fraser catalogued flood legends from dozens of cultures in the early 20th century. Joseph Campbell traced the archetype of death and rebirth across mythological traditions from every inhabited continent. And while the conventional academic explanation for these parallels tends to centre on independent invention, the idea that universal human experiences with local floods, storms, and seasonal destruction gave rise to similar mythological structures in unrelated cultures, there has always been a quieter, more speculative thread of inquiry that asks a different question. Not whether these stories arose independently, but whether some of them might carry, deep within their layered retellings, the echo of a real event, an event old enough to predate all written language, an event catastrophic enough to scar the collective memory of a species that had no other means of recording it. The idea that oral traditions can preserve genuine historical information across deep time was once dismissed as romantic nonsense. Myths change with every telling. Details are added, lost, embellished, reinterpreted. Over centuries, the original event, if there was one, is buried under so many layers of cultural elaboration that it becomes indistinguishable from pure invention. Or so the argument went, but in recent decades, this dismissal has been challenged by a series of remarkable studies, most notably by researchers working with Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, which represent the longest continuous cultural lineage on Earth. In 2015, a study by Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed examined Aboriginal stories describing coastal flooding and the loss of land to the sea. These stories, collected from communities across the Australian continent, described specific geographical features, bays, islands, stretches of coastline, that are consistent with conditions that existed when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today. When the geographical details were cross-referenced with geological data on post-glacial sea level rise, the stories appeared to describe landscapes that were inundated between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. If accurate, this would mean that some Aboriginal oral traditions have preserved reliable geographical information across more than 300 generations, a span of time that challenges every assumption about the limits of oral memory. If oral traditions can survive for 7,000 years, can they survive for 74,000? Almost certainly not in any form that would be recognizable or directly traceable to a specific event. But the question is not whether a story about Toba has been passed down intact for 74 millennia. The question is whether the experience of surviving a volcanic catastrophe, the darkness, the cold, the death of the familiar world, the desperate migration to new territory, could have embedded itself in the deeper strata of human narrative instinct, not as a specific memory, but as a template, a pattern, a story shape that recurs because the species that tells it was forged in a crucible of destruction and renewal, and the echo of that forging resonates in every subsequent myth about the end of the world. The Sumerian flood tablets, among the oldest written narratives in existence, describe a world destroyed by divine wrath and a single survivor who preserves the seed of life through the catastrophe. The Hindu Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu, who builds a boat to survive the pralaya that dissolves the age. The Norse Fimbulwinter, 3 successive winters with no intervening summer, is not a flood myth but a cold myth, a story of a world that dies not by drowning but by freezing. And this detail, if one is inclined to speculate, resonates uncomfortably with what a volcanic winter might actually have felt like to the people living through it. Not water rising, but warmth receding. Not a sudden drowning, but a slow, season-by-season disappearance of the sun's strength, until the world itself seemed to be dying of cold. Speculation, of course, is not evidence. And the distance between Toba and the earliest written myths, a gap of more than 60,000 years, is so vast that any direct connection must remain in the realm of possibility rather than proof. But the persistence of the pattern is itself a datum, the fact that every culture, on every continent, tells a story about a world that ended and was reborn. This fact does not require Toba to explain it, but it does not exclude it either. And the possibility that the deepest narrative instinct of the human species, the conviction that the world has ended before and may end again, is not merely imaginative, but experiential, rooted in the actual survival of an actual catastrophe that the species endured before it had words to describe it. This possibility is, at the very least, worth holding in mind as the story continues, because the myths do not only tell us about destruction, they tell us about what comes after, about the remnant, about the rebuilding, about the strange, persistent human conviction that survival is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. And 65,000 years after a volcano nearly ended everything, the survivors' descendants looked up from a different continent at a different sky and began to wonder whether it could happen again. Beneath the rolling green farmland of northwestern Wyoming, at a depth of roughly 8 kilometers, a reservoir of magma sits in the Earth's crust like a held breath. It has been there for hundreds of thousands of years. It is not erupting. It is not, by any conventional measure, doing anything at all. The geysers and hot springs that make Yellowstone one of the most visited national parks in the United States. Old Faithful, the grand prismatic spring, the bubbling mud pots that smell of sulfur and deep earth chemistry, are surface expressions of the heat below, gentle reminders that the ground beneath the tourist's feet is not entirely solid, not entirely settled, not entirely safe. But the magma chamber itself, mapped by seismic tomography and ground deformation measurements, remains in what volcanologists carefully describe as a state of quiescence. Not dormancy, not extinction. Quiescence. A word that means quiet, but does not mean finished. Yellowstone is a supervolcano. Its caldera, formed by the most recent supereruption approximately 640,000 years ago, measures roughly 70 by 45 kilometers. Two earlier supereruptions, at roughly 1.3 million and 2.1 million years ago, left their own calderas in the landscape, a pattern of periodic, catastrophic release that suggests the system operates on timescales measured in hundreds of thousands of years. The recurrence interval is not regular enough to serve as a countdown clock, and the United States Geological Survey has been at pains to emphasize that the probability of a Yellowstone supereruption in any given year is approximately 1 in 730,000, a number so small as to be functionally negligible in the context of any individual human lifetime, and yet the system is active. The ground deforms, the seismographs record swarms of small earthquakes. The chemistry of the hot springs changes subtly over time, reflecting shifts in the magma's composition and temperature. Yellowstone is not the only candidate. Beneath the western outskirts of Naples, Italy, lies the Campi Flegrei caldera, the Phlegraean Fields, a volcanic system that has been in a state of slow uplift since the 1950s, its ground rising centimeters per year in a process called bradyseism, driven by the injection of magmatic fluids into shallow rock layers. The most recent eruption of Campi Flegrei was in 1538, a relatively minor event that created a small cone called Monte Nuovo, but the caldera itself was formed by a supereruption approximately 39,000 years ago, an event called the Campanian Ignimbrita, which blanketed much of the eastern Mediterranean in ash and may have contributed to the decline of Neanderthal populations in Europe. In 2024 and 2025, a series of earthquake swarms beneath the caldera raised concern among Italian geologists and prompted updated evacuation planning for the densely populated neighborhoods that sit directly above the restless magma. The question that Toba forces us to ask about these systems is not whether they will erupt. Over geological time, the answer is almost certainly yes, but whether the world that has been built since the last supereruption is capable of surviving one. And the answer to that question is not reassuring, because the world of 74,000 years ago, for all its harshness, possessed a quality that the modern world does not: redundancy. The small bands of hunter-gatherers who survived the Toba bottleneck were self-sufficient in the most fundamental sense. They produced their own food, made their own tools, carried their knowledge in their heads, and relied on no supply chain longer than their own legs could walk. When the environment failed in one area, they moved to another. When one food source collapsed, they switched to a different one. Their vulnerability was demographic. They were few and they were fragile. But their resilience was structural. They could absorb environmental shocks because their systems of survival were local, flexible, and distributed. The modern world is the opposite. 8 billion people sustained by an agricultural system that depends on stable growing seasons, predictable precipitation, and the uninterrupted flow of global trade. Cities that import their food from thousands of kilometers away. Supply chains that stretch across oceans, through choke points, across borders governed by complex political arrangements that are themselves vulnerable to disruption. A global economy in which a volcanic winter lasting even 2 or 3 years, let alone the decade or more that Toba may have imposed, would collapse food production on a scale that no existing emergency infrastructure could manage. The grain reserves of the world's major producing nations are measured in months, not years. A supereruption that reduced global agricultural output by even 30% for a sustained period would trigger famines of a scale not seen in recorded history. This is not speculative alarmism. It is the sober conclusion of researchers who have modelled the agricultural consequences of major volcanic eruptions and extrapolated those models to supervolcanic scales. The 1815 Tambora eruption caused widespread crop failure across Europe and North America, and Tambora was roughly 1/17 the size of Toba. A Toba-scale event in the modern world would not merely cause inconvenience or economic disruption, it would challenge the fundamental capacity of industrial civilization to feed itself. And here is where the lesson of the Toba survivors becomes something more than a historical curiosity. Because the quality that saved them, behavioral flexibility, the ability to shift strategies rapidly in response to environmental change, the willingness to abandon what was no longer working and try something new, is precisely the quality that large, complex, interconnected systems tend to suppress. Efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. The modern food system is extraordinarily efficient. It feeds 8 billion people using a smaller percentage of the population engaged in agriculture than at any point in human history. But efficiency is achieved through specialization, and specialization creates dependency, and dependency creates fragility. The farmer in Iowa grows corn and buys everything else. The city dweller buys everything. The entire system assumes that the supply chain will continue to function, that the climate will remain within the range to which the crops have been adapted, that the slow, reliable turning of the seasons will continue without interruption. 74,000 years ago, the seasons were interrupted, and the people who survived were not the ones who had built the most efficient systems. They were the ones who could change. The distance between then and now is measured not just in years, but in a kind of structural inversion. The survivors of Toba were few, scattered and adaptable. The inheritors of their survival are many, concentrated and rigid, and the volcanoes beneath the surface, Yellowstone, Campi Flegrei, Taupo in New Zealand, the unnamed caldera systems that may not yet have been identified, remain as indifferent to this irony as the Earth has always been to the plains of the species living on its surface. There is a shoreline somewhere in eastern Africa. It doesn't matter exactly where, because the specifics have been swallowed by 74,000 years of tides and tectonics and the slow, patient rearrangement of sand and stone, where a small group of people once stood and watched the sea. They had no name for themselves that survives. They had no written language, no monuments, no institution that could carry their story forward across the chasm of time that separates them from us. They had only their bodies, their tools, their children, and whatever fragile web of social connection held them together in a world that had recently tried, with considerable force, to erase them entirely. The sky above them may still have carried a faint haze, the last attenuated remnants of a sulphate veil that had dimmed the sun for years, or perhaps by then the haze had cleared, and the light that fell on the water was the full, unfiltered light of a world recovering. The archaeological record cannot tell us what the sky looked like that day. It cannot tell us whether they were hungry or fed, mourning or celebrating, preparing to move or settling in to stay. It can tell us only that they were there, that they existed, that they had not vanished. This fact, their existence, their stubborn, undocumented persistence at the edge of a continent and the edge of extinction, is the foundation on which everything that followed was built. Every city that would rise, every language that would be spoken, every act of cruelty and every act of kindness that would unfold across the subsequent millennia, all of it rests on the survival of people whose names, faces, thoughts and fears are permanently beyond recovery. They are the most important people who ever lived, and they are the most thoroughly forgotten. The paradox is not incidental, it is structural. The very depth of the catastrophe that made their survival so consequential is what makes their individual lives so irretrievable. What we carry from them is not memory, it is code. The genetic sequences that passed through the bottleneck and diversified on the other side, branching into the variations that would eventually produce every human population on Earth. The mitochondrial lineages that trace through an unbroken chain of mothers back to women who lived in that narrow window of near extinction. Women who bore children into a world of ash and cold, and whose decision to keep bearing them, to keep nursing them, to keep carrying them through landscapes of diminished resources and uncertain futures, was the single most consequential act of faith in the history of biology. They did not know they were saving the species. They were saving their children. The species was saved as a side effect. And there is something in this that resists the grand narratives, the stories of destiny and progress and inevitable ascent that civilizations tend to tell about themselves. Because the Toba story is not a story of triumph. It is a story of accident, of geography, of the blind luck of being in the right refugium at the right moment, with the right skills and the right social connections. When the sky went dark and the world grew cold, the survivors were not chosen. They were not special in any cosmic or theological sense. They were simply the ones who did not die. And from the absence of death, that negative space, that mere continuation, everything else emerged. It is tempting to draw lessons from this, to say that the Toba story teaches resilience or adaptability or the importance of community in times of crisis. And perhaps it does. The evidence from Pinnacle Point and Shinfa-Metema and the genetic record all suggest that flexibility, behavioural, social, ecological, was the quality most strongly associated with survival. The groups that could shift their diets, that could move to new environments, that could maintain social networks across distances and hardships, were the groups that made it through. Rigidity was a death sentence. The inability to change was in the cold mathematics of Pleistocene survival, the same as the inability to continue. But there is a deeper lesson, one that is less comfortable and less often spoken. It is this. The human species has already been to the edge. It has already looked into the void of its own extinction and, by the thinnest of margins, through no plan or foresight or divine intervention, stepped back. The bottleneck is not a myth. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, quantifiable reality, written in the DNA of every person alive, visible in the shallow genetic diversity that connects a Mongolian herder to a Brazilian fisherman, to a Finnish architect, to a Kenyan runner. We're all survivors. We're all descended from the few. And the distance between existence and non-existence, between a species that populates every continent and a species that vanishes without a trace. That distance was once measured in the number of people who could fit in a single cave. The volcanoes have not stopped. The magma chambers beneath Yellowstone and Campi, Phlegrae, and the arcs of the Pacific Ring of Fire continue their slow, indifferent accumulations of pressure and heat. The Earth does not know that it carries 8 billion passengers. It does not care. And the possibility, remote, improbable, but not zero, that the sky could darken again, that the cold could return, that the thread of human existence could once more be drawn thin enough to snap. This possibility is not a paranoid fantasy. It is a geological certainty, differing from the present only in timing, not if, but when. And when is a question that geology answers in its own time, not ours. But tonight the sky is clear, or clouded, or lit by stars, or by the glow of a city whose lights would have been unimaginable to the people who stood on that African shore and watched the sea recover its colour after years of grey. The distance between their world and ours is immense, and it is also nothing, a chain of parents and children unbroken, stretching from their hands to ours, each link forged in the simple, relentless, unremarkable act of staying alive long enough to pass the thread forward. They did not know they were the beginning of everything. They knew only that the morning had come again, that the water still moved, that there was food to find and fire to tend and children to carry. And in the silence that the volcano had left behind, a silence so deep it swallowed entire lineages, entire futures, entire worlds that would never exist. They did the only thing that any living creature has ever been able to do in the face of annihilation. They continued, and the ash settled into the earth, and the earth folded it into stone, and the stone sank beneath the weight of new centuries, and the people walked on, away from the darkness, towards something they could not yet see, carrying nothing but each other and the quiet, unwritten certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The lake in Sumatra is still tonight. The water reflects whatever light the sky offers. And somewhere beneath its surface, beneath the sediment and the stone and the memory of fire, the mountain that once stood there holds its silence, not as peace, but as patience. The kind of patience that the earth has always had, and that the species living on its surface has only just begun to understand.